We've all had an awful time of it for the last 6 months. Get on this train and you're going somewhere safe. I just can't imagine what that must be like.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this Mishcon Academy session, a series of online events, videos and podcasts looking at the biggest issues faced by business and individuals today. I'm Adam Rose, a partner here at Mishcon de Rea, and it's my pleasure today to welcome Martin Hyman. Martin is a trustee of two refugee and race relations-based charities, the International Rescue Committee and of Highest J-Corps, which is how I met him as I used to chair that charity. Various lecturing roles and directorships are held by Martin. In particular, he's director of fractional CFO business for SMEs. He's also a volunteer mentor with the King's Trust, and he's a regular speaker on behalf of the Northern Holocaust Education Group. So welcome, Martin. Why don't you start just by telling us a bit about yourself, a bit about your family story, your mother in particular, and let's see how the conversation goes.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming in, for inviting me here today. As Adam says, I'll tell you a little bit about my family story and about myself over the next half hour or so. If we start, this is some of my family that you can see on the screen. They're the Beres family, and I'll start telling you their story. On the left, that's Max, my grandpa, and he was born in the 1880s in a place called Brody, which is now part of Ukraine, and he worked in import and export. And in the middle, that's my grandma, Rosa. She was also born in a place that we're sadly all too familiar with now, Lviv, but was called Lemberg back then, obviously also now in Ukraine. And like many women back then, she was a housewife. And on the right, that's my mum, Ilse. And they're the three main members of my family whose lives were changed in unbelievable ways by the Holocaust. But I'm going to start the story telling you about my family, not in the 1930s or the 1940s, but back in the 1880s and 1890s. Because back then, when Rosa and Max were living in Ukraine, there were a lot of what were pogroms, both in Russia and in Ukraine. And a pogrom was simply when local inhabitants, surrounding villages, would uprise and riot against Jewish settlements, Jewish villages. And by rioting, I don't just mean a little bit of a protest. They would go to the Jewish villages, they would attack Jewish people, they would loot Jewish houses, Jewish shops, Jewish businesses, perhaps burn down the houses, and in many instances, murder and rape Jewish people living there. And I'd like to have thought that back then the equivalent, the Ukrainian police, the Ukrainian authorities would have done whatever they could to stop that. But exactly the opposite happened. The authorities supported the rioting. They'd join in. They'd encourage it. And that made it a very, very difficult and awful time to be Jewish in Russia or Ukraine. And I'm sure that's why my family, why Rosa and Max, together with Rose's parents, left. They left the Lviv area, the Lemberg area, and moved west to Vienna. And that's about 200 miles. And I'm sure you probably can't get planes out of Lviv at the moment, I don't know. But if you could, it's probably, what, an hour, 2 hours plane journey, pretty quick on the train. But back then, obviously, no planes in the 1890s. And I'd imagine it's a journey they probably had to do on foot. So not a journey they would have taken very lightly at all, and carry everything with you that you possessed that you wanted to keep. But it wasn't just my family that did that. The Jewish population of Vienna, as an example, in 1860 was about 6,000. Just 40 years later, by 1900, by the turn of that century, it was nearly 150,000. So tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews were moving west to Vienna, to Berlin, to Prague, and other places in Central Europe to escape the pogroms. And to start with, they had a very happy life there. They integrated into Viennese Austrian society. My grandpa had a job in import and exports, I think I've mentioned, working with Jewish people, possibly, certainly with non-Jewish people, and they had Jewish and non-Jewish friends. And they'd do all the social things that people would have done back then in Central Europe. And in 1924, my mum, Ilse, was born. And again, she had a very happy childhood to start with. She was in school plays. She liked playing with her friends. You can see her there in the park with two of her closest friends. The one in the middle, her friend Eva, she stayed in touch with for the rest of her life. She went skiing. Obviously, it's nice and easy to do from Austria. Despite that, she clearly was not very good at it. But I think that's one thing I've certainly inherited from her. And so she had a very happy childhood to start with. But at the same time, as Mum was growing up in Austria, in Germany, as I'm sure you all know, in 1933 and then consolidated in 1934, Hitler took power and the Nazis took power in Germany. As Hitler became Führer in 1934 after the death of President Heisenberg. And the economy in Germany back then was awful in between the wars. Had hyperinflation, mass unemployment, things were very, very difficult. And rather than trying to sort out the economy, one of the first things that Hitler did when he seized power was to put in place anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish laws. Really, as a scapegoat. Who can we blame for all this? We'll blame the Jews. The economy's in a mess, it's the Jews' fault. So almost immediately on seizing power, it became illegal for Jews to be civil servants, to be lawyers, and many other professions. And he further consolidated that in 1935 with the Nuremberg laws, which started to make it illegal for Jews to be teachers, for Jews and non-Jews to have relationships or to be married. Just gradually ostracising Jews more and more from society. And then it became illegal for Jews to go to school, Jewish children obviously, to go to school. But all of that was in Germany. And my family lived in Austria. So while the two countries obviously border each other, it was separate. And I'm sure they would have been concerned about what was happening in a neighbouring country, but it didn't directly impact on them. That all changed in March of 1938. In March of 1938, the Nazis marched into Austria. And unlike, when the Russians marched into Ukraine almost 3 years ago now, and the Ukrainians fought back and are still fighting back, Austrians didn't fight back at all. There's pictures, I've got pictures of the Austrians just waving and welcoming the Nazis in, waving Nazi flags. And one of the reasons for that was, obviously they've got a common language, but also up until the end of the First World War, Austria was a key linchpin of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was before the First World War was a big, powerful empire. That was all disbanded by the Treaty of Versailles, and Austria became a fairly small, fairly insignificant country. And many Austrians perceived that by joining up with Germany and embracing Germany into one greater German country, one greater Germany, they could become big and powerful again, or part of a big, powerful entity again. So they welcomed the Austrians in. But that meant, for my family, for Rosa and Max and Ilse, my mum, that all the anti-Semitic laws, all the anti-Jewish laws that had been placed in Germany over a number of years became law in Austria literally overnight. And my mum told me that within a few days of the Anschluss, it was called the Anschluss when the Nazis marched into Austria, that my grandpa was forced to clean the streets. But he, along with many other Viennese Jews, were forced to clean the streets. And as you can see there, they weren't given big brushes or whatever tools you'd have used back then to clean the streets. They're on their hands and knees, in some cases with little scrubbing brushes, and in some cases with literally with toothbrushes to clean graffiti off the streets. And every time I look at that picture, because I've been, as Adam says, I've been doing this talk on numerous occasions for the last 2 or 3 years now, I see a different thing. To start with, I just saw, why aren't people helping? You know, you wouldn't clean the streets with a scrubbing brush. Why are people just watching and humiliating them? And if you look close, you can see the people, they're laughing. And these aren't complete strangers. These are people who, up until a few days ago, were their neighbours, their friends maybe, their work colleagues, people who they knew them well. They're just standing and watching them being humiliated. But worse than that, something I only noticed recently, to clean the streets with a brush, you've got to be on your hands and knees. So you're literally kneeling in subjugation. And the people that aren't helping probably thought, oh, well, it doesn't affect us. We might get into trouble. What will the Nazis do to us if we help? But they're doing nothing. This is years, several years before Auschwitz and the gas chambers were built, before there were mass exterminations there, or by shooting, or people in burial pits, but people are just watching and doing nothing. And in my mind, that's just the start of accepting it was all right to treat Jews differently. Because the Jews weren't working with you anymore. The Jews didn't go to school with your children because they weren't allowed to go to school. And in school, unlike today here in England, children are taught everybody's equal. We're all different, we're all unique, but everybody's the same. Back then, in Germany and Austria, children were taught that Jews were subhuman, somewhere in between animals and people. So again, it makes it easier to humiliate them, doesn't it, and not treat them as well. Because they're not really human anyway, so we can treat them differently. We can make them do these awful jobs. I just can't imagine how humiliating it must have been for, my granddad, and the hundreds of other Jews that were made to do the same thing, and feeling powerless. And that's my grandpa again, that's Max again. He'd fought for the Austro-Hungarian Empire alongside Germany in the First World War. As I said, he and Rosa, my grandma, had become very integrated into Austrian life and Viennese life. I'm sure in his mind, how could he possibly be the enemy? But the Nuremberg laws and the Anschluss meant that to the Nazis, he was the enemy. He and his family were the enemy. He lost his job. My mum had to leave her school and lost many of her friends. Why? Simply because they were Jews. And it was an awful time for my family and millions of other Jews throughout Europe. And I think my grandpa must have seen the writing on the wall. He tried to get out, tried to escape. And they applied to go to Argentina. He'd never been to Argentina. I'm sure he knew very little about it. Obviously, it wasn't like today when we can quickly have a quick Google and we're suddenly experts in something. He certainly didn't speak Spanish, but he'd got a distant cousin who lived out in Argentina, so he applied for him and the family to go over there. But just like today, people weren't keen to take in refugees, so the Argentinians rejected his application. So they all had to stay in Vienna under Nazi rule. In November of 1938, a senior Nazi was shot and killed in France. And this was before, remember, the First World War, so France was not under Nazi occupation. The Nazis blamed a Jew for doing it. And as a result, Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister for the Nazis, said that anybody who attacked Jews or Jewish property on the 9th and 10th of November would not be punished, would not be arrested. So again, looking at the scapegoat, who can we blame? And that became called the November pogrom, or you may have heard it called Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. Because on those 2 days, just like in the pogroms that happened in Russia and Ukraine 40, 50 years earlier, Jews were attacked in the streets. Jewish property was burnt down. And you can see on the left there, that's one of the synagogues being burnt down. All bar 3 synagogues in Austria were burnt down. And the only reason those 3 were spared was because they were adjoining other important buildings, and obviously the fire would have spread. Jews would have been beaten up in the streets. Jewish shops were broken into, Jewish shops owned by Jewish people, and goods stolen. And again, the Sturmabteilung, who were the paramilitary arm of the Nazis, joined in. They encouraged it. Certainly weren't going to try and stop it. And like any riot, the more people see it happening, the more people joined in. And again, you haven't seen these people at work for a while because they're not allowed to work with you. Your children are coming home and telling you, did you realise that Jews are subhuman? So why wouldn't you take their goods? You've had a recession for years. Why not take somebody else's goods to help you if it's allowed and it's not from, human beings anyway? And everything just felt hopeless for Jews all over Germany and Austria.
Let me turn to what happened next in terms of your mother's story and the Kindertransport as we know it now. Do you want to just say a bit about your mother's situation at that stage and what the Kindertransport was?
Yeah, can I just say one more thing about the pogrom? My mum's told me that on the night of the November pogrom, they'd gone home to their flat where they lived. She says they were asleep. I don't know how you could have slept after that, but they were asleep in bed, probably petrified and exhausted, and there was loud banging on the door. And before they'd even managed to put some clothes on to answer and see what it was in the middle of the night, the door was smashed in. Nazis charged in and dragged my grandpa away. And my mum and my grandma didn't know where he was going to, being taken to, what would happen next to him, what would happen to them. They'd seen the horrors during the pogrom itself, and they were very, very scared. It said both for themselves and also, obviously, for him. And I still don't know where he was taken to. Many, many other Jewish men, and it was mostly, I think almost exclusively men that were taken away that night. Many were taken to Dachau, which is a concentration camp near Munich, which isn't that far away from Vienna. Others were taken to police cells in Vienna itself. Don't know which one my grandpa was taken to, and he probably wouldn't have known either. But he did come back a few days later, Adam, but he'd been very, very badly beaten up. And I think that's really when my family realised it just was not safe anymore to be there in Austria under the Nazis. But coming back to the Kindertransport, and shortly after the November pogrom, there was a lot of lobbying in this country. And what can we do? Because clearly it's dangerous, fatal for Jews to be in Austria and Germany particularly, but many other places within Central Europe. And the British government agreed to allow children who were the victims of Nazi persecution, so not just Jews, but they were mostly Jews who'd been the victims of Nazi persecution, to come here to Britain.
I'm just going to interrupt there quickly and just pick up on the word that you said there, the children.
Yeah.
So the programme only extended to children?
Absolutely. It only extended to children. You had to be under 17 to come on the programme. And not only did you have to be under 17, but it wasn't just anybody. There was far more than... In the end, the programme brought 10,000 children over. There were far more than 10,000 children who were the victims of Nazi persecution. You had to apply, and there were criteria that it's a bit hazy, but certainly it would have excluded disabled people, people with learning difficulties from coming, and you had to effectively be sponsored to the tune of £50 which is the equivalent of about £4,000. But remember that certainly in Germany, Jews hadn't been able to do many jobs for a number of years. In Austria, it might have only been 6 months, but that's 6 months with no income. So £4,000 is a lot of money anyway. It would have been a fortune when you haven't worked and you're worrying about everything else. And so that sponsorship was for the British government to make sure that the children wouldn't be a financial burden on the state here. And a lot of the money for the children was put up by the Quakers. Obviously, some was provided, some families may have had sufficient money, but a lot of it was provided by the Quakers. And my mum was lucky, if you can call it lucky, being a victim of the Holocaust, but she got on the second Kindertransport train to leave Vienna in 1938. And all of the transports came by train, mainly from Prague, Berlin, and Vienna. And if I just go on to the next slide, there you can see parents waving goodbye to children as they got on the train in Vienna.
So she was how old by then?
She'd have been 13 then. She'd never been away from her parents before, overnight. And I don't know how many of you are parents here today, but I know when my children were younger, when they were at primary school, they went on their first overnight school trip. And I, along with all the other parents, turned up to drop them off. And they were going away with all their friends from school. They were going to be with teachers that they know, I wouldn't say love, but they knew, teaching assistants. And we knew we were going to get a WhatsApp or a Facebook or something later that day with lots of smiling faces. And I still saw plenty of parents in tears as they got onto the coach. And we knew exactly what was going to happen. We almost had a minute-by-minute itinerary.
Being fully health and safety tested.
Oh, absolutely, full health and safety tested. You're putting your child on a train, knowing that in theory it was going to England, but would it really go to England? Not knowing what would happen to them when they got to England, not knowing who would look after them, not knowing when you'd hear from them again. Obviously, no social media, no phones. There was only letters.
Did your family have any family in England?
No, no family at all. I'm not aware, other than the distant cousin in Austria, of any family outside of Central Europe. So I just can't imagine what it must be like, both as a parent, to just basically give your child away, hoping, knowing or feeling that you're going to see them again sometime, but not knowing where or when, or as a child who'd never been away from home, saying, get on this train. We've all had an awful time of it for the last 6 months. Get on this train and you're going somewhere safe. I just can't imagine what that must be like.
So that was when, in 38?
That was December 1938.
And she gets on the train in Vienna?
She gets on the train in Vienna on the 8th of December. And that train, and she knew nobody. There was no friends with her, no one that she knew at all. And as I say, you had to be under 17, so really 16 and younger. But there were newborn babies there. Parents, with a newborn thinking, this is an awful life if I have my baby here. So you'd have the older children, such as my mum, almost looking after the toddlers and the newborns who couldn't look after themselves on that journey. And the train would have gone through Austria into Germany, through Germany, and then to the Netherlands. But all the kinder, which is the children on the Kindertransport, all they could take with them was one small suitcase, one toy, and nothing of any value. Because if they had anything of any value, the Nazis would just take it off them. And my mum said she was sitting on the train in a carriage, 'cause it was all carriages back in those days, absolutely petrified. And the Nazis were marching up and down with big German shepherds, and they made her empty a suitcase. Again, for no reason I can think of other than to humiliate her. They probably saw that she was particularly scared. They said made her empty it to humiliate her. And then the one toy she'd taken with, which was a teddy bear, they took off her. Again, obviously, I'm sure no Nazi wanted a teddy bear, it's not exactly of any value. But again, because they knew that would make her cry even more. and be even more scared, and for them to feel powerful. And my mum, for the rest of her life, was absolutely scared of dogs. And I'm sure a big part of that was seeing the German Shepherds there in that position of power.
So I've seen your mother's birth certificate, and I know she was born on the 23rd of
December.
23rd December.
Yes.
And she got to England when?
I think it was the 12th of December, 1938.
So just before she turned 14.
Just before her 14th birthday, yes.
And what happened? Where did she land? Where did she go? What was the story next?
Well, when she landed, when they got to the Hook of Holland in the Netherlands, which obviously wasn't under Nazi control then, they were put onto a boat that went from the Hook of Holland to Harwich, which was in East Anglia. And from there, she went to a place called Dovercourt. And Dovercourt was a holiday camp, but obviously nothing like Centre Parks or Haven. It was very much wooden shacks designed for the summer. She arrived, as you said, Adam, in December. So there was no heating because it was designed for the summer when people went on holiday. So Mum said there was ice on the inside of the windows. They served her food that it wasn't nice, but she wasn't familiar with. So all the things that might give us comfort if we're away from home, totally different. Things like porridge and jelly, which might sound strange, but it's just strange food when you've come from Central Europe and you want something to remind you of home. And you were surrounded by people, that was looking after you that don't speak German. And she didn't, she had a smuttering of a few words of English. So she was very scared. And you mentioned health and safety before, Adam. And the idea of Dovercourt, effectively a refugee camp, it wasn't that the children would live there forever, but it was a holding place before they moved on elsewhere. And not only there was no health and safety back then, there was no safeguarding. So to find a family to look after you, it was, I suppose, if you were the family, relatively straightforward. You just go, yeah, I'll have you, or I'll have you.
So just to stop there,
Yes,
so
yeah.
a trainload of kids turn up at Dovercourt.
Yes, yeah.
Aged almost 14, being one of the older ones there.
Well, they could have been up to 16.
Up to 16.
Yeah.
And at that stage, she didn't know where she would go after Dovercourt.
She'd no idea what was going to happen next.
And what did happen next?
What happened next was nothing. Well, many of the people that wanted to choose a child, because there were adverts in the papers saying that little mugshot and a few words. And people would want either the little kids, the toddlers, because they're small and cute, or the 16-year-olds, because they're a bit bigger, a bit more intelligent, a bit more stronger, and they could help around the house. They could do the cleaning, the gardening. Perhaps if you've got a shop, they could help in the shop. So people wanted unpaid servants, effectively, or they wanted the cute kids. Nobody wanted, young teenagers who were a bit awkward, but not big enough and strong enough to really be. So she was there for quite a few weeks, and it was cold. Dark.
So she had her 14th birthday in
She had her
Dovercourt.
14th birthday there on her own. I'm sure she'd met people, but no one she really, would say was a close friend. And it was just very cold and dark and lonely. But eventually she was taken in. She was taken in by a family called the Lessers who lived in Birmingham.
They were a Jewish family?
They were a Jewish family. I'm not sure how they chose her or what made them choose her. I'd like to think out of kindness and wanting to help. And she went to live with them in Birmingham, where she lived for the rest of her life. But they were quite a lot, firstly, they obviously weren't her parents, but they were a lot older than her parents would have been. They were in their early 60s. She was 14 by the time she went there. Whilst they had children, they were adult children who'd left home and were married. And they were obviously very good to my mum because she stayed there until she got married herself about 10 years later. And she befriended their older nephew who also lived there, who was probably, I'm guessing, about 10 years older than her. And they stayed in touch for the rest of his life. And I remember him coming round when I was a child, coming round to the house quite often. But it must have been a very lonely situation for her, and a very miserable situation, being basically a child refugee away from home, away from everything you were familiar with. And you mentioned the kinder transport. And the kinder transport, my mum was one of the earlier children. That carried on until September 1939, when the Second World War started.
So it went on for about 10, 11 months?
Yeah, 9, 10 months,
I
yes,
guess.
yeah.
And about 1,000 kids a month, roughly.
Yeah, I don't know if it was even, but yes,
Yeah.
that sort of order. And I say those kids, not just from Vienna, but from the trains would have arrived from Berlin and Prague as well.
So I know you've got in your sort of in the family
Yes.
archives,
Yes, yeah.
folder or however you keep them.
Yeah,
You've got some letters and things like
Yeah.
that from back
Yeah,
home.
yeah. When I first saw them when I was about 16, my mum had this folder, there's probably about 30, 40 letters and in them from her parents, my grandparents to her. And I was probably a typical stroppy 16-year-old. You have to agree with me there, Adam.
I do agree.
You do. And these were letters in German, in handwriting that was difficult to read anyway. They weren't addressed to me. I wasn't very interested, and I just put them away, which probably broke my mum's heart in hindsight, because it was the one remaining tangible connection she'd got with her parents. And I almost forgot about them. And then when my mum died about 12 years ago now, I rediscovered them, and I had them translated into English. And I started reading them and reading them and reading them again, because they told me so much about my mum as a child, as a young person, and about my grandparents who I never met.
Tell me a bit about your grandparents. You've mentioned you did import and export. What's that mean?
That's a very good question, Adam. I don't know either. Because again, my mum told me, I'm sure when your children were 13, they probably still don't know what you do. But I'm sure
They're not alone.
there's people here that don't know what you do, Adam.
I don't know what I do.
Yeah, but I think he probably said to Ilse as a 11, 12, 13-year-old, Daddy works in import and export. And I went with my mum. I went once when I was interrailing and saw where she lived, which by the time I went with my mum was now an office block. But Mum had always said she'd never go back to Austria. And then probably about 10 years before she died, she decided she wanted to go back just the once. And she showed me the office that my grandpa used to work in. So he worked in an office doing import and export. I have no idea whether he was a drug dealer or worked for the equivalent of DPD, but import and export. And
Tell me a bit about the letters.
the letters, yeah. And the letters, I just couldn't stop reading them, because they really, not just the individual ones, but they tell a story as you go through. I'll just read out a few extracts from little bits. But this is December 1938, a fortnight after she'd left home. We were thrilled to receive the postcard you sent from Nuremberg, as well as your 2 letters. I probably don't need to tell you anymore that you should behave yourself. Mrs. Wise would really like to get Susie out, but it's really hard. Lots and lots of kisses from Mummy. And then just a few months later, in April 1939, for the last 10 days, the weather's been great. And yet we're constantly at home. Why? You must know already. And then although the war started in September, and she said Austria and Britain were at war, my mum still got letters. And I don't know how much of that is because of my grandpa's connection with import-export. He wasn't working by then, but I'm sure he still had people he knew that could get things out. And then Uncle won't be able to work anymore. Daddy hasn't got much work, but it's all right. And that's in December 1939, just before Germany invaded France, Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. And in May of 1940, so just a couple of years after we saw people standing by and watching us, my grandpa and others were forced to clean the streets, the death camp at Auschwitz was established. And in June of 1941, Mrs. Polivka told us, you mentioned you hadn't heard from us in a while. This surprises us very much, especially since we write to you regularly and reply to your letters straight away. One of my favourites, August 1941, it seems like our little poppet has become a proper lady who goes to clubs and casinos. I like that one as well. I don't remember telegrams either. Adam probably does. But with telegrams, the way they used to work was you used to go to post office, you'd write out your message, you'd pay, I think, by the letter, and then somebody would send it, and the post would type it in, and it would go down the wire to the other end where it'd be printed out and then hand delivered. So I suppose it's the nearest they had then to instant messaging. It would take a day and you'd only send small things. But because you write it out at this end, I've got some of the telegrams that my mum sent to my grandparents. So it wasn't, this is March of 1942. And I'm guessing there weren't some earlier, probably because she didn't have the money or the wherewithal to think about sending telegrams rather than letters. Beloved, overjoyed about your message, doing extremely well, tailor shop great, very good progress, school nice, everyone sweet, a million kisses, yours, Ilse. And then in April of 1942, no news from you in a long time, worried. Please write immediately. I'm doing extremely well. Making progress at the tailor shop, going out a lot, kisses to everyone, yours, Ilse. And so I've got several dozen letters.
And when was that? Just again?
That was, sorry, April 1942. And I've got several dozen letters, overall. But to me, there's a very clear pattern. It starts off similar to the sort of messages I might have sent my kids. You probably sent yours, Adam, when they were younger. Are you behaving yourself? Are you happy? Most importantly, is the food all right? But very, very quickly, remember that they're writing to a 14-year-old girl in a foreign country. Do you know anyone who can get us out of here? There might be some immigration lawyers amongst you here. If someone asked me, how could I get somebody out of another country? I wouldn't know where to start. And then, we all try and put on a brave face and show positive things to our young children. Is there anything you can do to get us out of here? Is there any way you can help? To a young child, she's still only 14. And there's one that I read out from my grandpa where he's saying, the weather's great, but we're constantly at home. You must know why. Because clearly he felt, and I'd imagine rightly, that if they put anything negative about the Nazis or about what was going on, the letters were almost certainly going to be read. Not only would the letter not make it through, but the repercussions to them would be horrific. And you can see that some of the letters weren't getting through by the fact that I think both my mum and my grandma are saying, not heard from you in a long time. And it sounds like, certainly to start with, they're writing almost daily. Just that love and that scaredness they must have both felt. And you asked me about the date of the letter, of that last telegram, which was April 1942. And that's about the same time as the letters stopped coming from Austria. There were fairly frequent letters with gaps, but fairly frequent letters from literally the month that Mum got on the train, but then from the summer of 1942, there were no more letters.
So I guess everyone can imagine what might have happened next to your grandparents, but do you want to tell us what you think did happen next?
Well, things that, not even think, but there's bits that I know what happened next, because the Nazis kept very detailed documentation about most of what they did. Some of it they destroyed, just before the camps were liberated and before the Nazis were overrun, to hide it, but still a vast amount of documentation. There's even more now, being discovered all the time in archives. And my grandparents were sent to a place called Theresienstadt. And Theresienstadt's about an hour's north of Prague. And Theresienstadt was a ghetto. And a ghetto in the sense of you could only go into it or out of it with the Nazis' permission. You wouldn't ask for permission to go in, they forced you to go in, but you could only leave it with their permission. And you would have many families living in one house, cramped bedrooms, no clean water, no medicine, very little fresh food. And we all saw, 4 or 5 years ago during COVID, when we were told to be 2 meters apart because how quickly diseases spread. There, when you've got several families into one ill-kept house with no medicine and no clean water, diseases spread ridiculously rapidly. So many, many people were murdered, not with a gun, not in a gas chamber, just by putting them into conditions where you had no choice. You know, there was nothing else that could happen. That you were going to get diseases, and certainly vulnerable people did not survive very long. And my grandparents were amongst 144,000 Jews who were sent to Theresienstadt. And of those, 33,000 were murdered there. And another 88,000 were sent to Auschwitz. And I'm sure we know what would have happened at that point. So very, very few survived. And these are original Nazi documentation. The one on the left is very brief. It's a death certificate, or in my mind, a murder certificate. That's for Max, my grandpa. And he was cremated on the 10th of October, 1942. I don't know how he was murdered. That's the only information I've got. On the right, you can probably see it says transported. That's the transport documentation for my grandma Rosa, almost exactly 2 years later, on the 9th of October 1944, to be sent to Auschwitz. She was put on a train to Auschwitz. There's no record of having arrived at Auschwitz, and I don't know whether that's because the record was destroyed. I don't know whether because at that time, and of her age then, early 40s, she'd have been sent straight to the gas chamber, and it was such a production line, there wasn't time to keep records, it was just process them along, or whether she was murdered on the train journey. The only thing I know is neither Rosa or Max ever saw or spoke to their only child, their only daughter Ilse again, after waving goodbye to her, saying goodbye to her on the train station in Vienna in December of 1938.
You want to pick up what happened with Ilse after that?
Yeah. Ilse, well, as you can see, she married my dad, as I mentioned already, in 1948. And that was in Birmingham. But none of my mum's family were at her wedding. They'd all been murdered. And she lived very happily in Birmingham for the rest of her life, or as happily as you can, knowing that all of your parents, all your family had been murdered. And Mum, the Holocaust, you know, it wasn't just over for her in 1945 with the liberation of the camps. It continued. You know, there was always something there. If there was anything on TV about the Holocaust, she would just sit there almost in a trance watching it. She wouldn't talk, didn't want to say much about it afterwards, but it was a massive, massive part of who she was. And I think since she passed away, I've almost taken on that mantle in many, many ways. But she lived in Birmingham with my dad for the rest of her life. And she worked as a dressmaker. And she and my dad, they were very happy together, with the odd moment, obviously, for nearly 65 years, till she died in 2013. And she went on to have one child, me, and 2 grandsons. And first time I put this photo in, because although she's no longer around, her family, my grandson, who was born about a month ago, carrying on the family. No, the Nazis tried to end the family, tried to end Jews full stop, but it is carrying on. But by the time, sorry, just the history bit really, no, by 1945, by the time the war ended and Auschwitz had been liberated, as I'm sure everybody knows, 6 million Jews had been murdered, but that includes 1.5 million Jewish children.
Your mother was very lucky to get here.
Oh, incredibly lucky. You know, she had an awful run up to it. I can't imagine what it must be like to lose your parents and have them murdered and not knowing for a long time what was happening to them. But very, very lucky, because of the Jewish population of Europe before the war, before the Holocaust, was 9 million. So 2/3 were murdered. 2/3 were just wiped out within the space of a few years.
So one of the things that you and I spoke about when we caught up a couple of weeks ago before this was the fact that this whole family has probably disappeared, were probably murdered in the Holocaust. But I guess, and one of the things I was saying to you that I had done, I don't have a Holocaust story in my background, but was DNA testing, and we have discovered distant cousins who share DNA lines. And I don't know if that's something, I know when we spoke, you sort of said, I'd never thought about it and I was thinking about it. I don't know if you've given any more thought to it and what that might achieve. I have no idea.
Well, that's something I'm definitely planning to do. Up until our conversation, what had worried me most was what was going to happen to my DNA. But I met a data lawyer who said it might.
He said it was okay.
He said it might be okay. So I thought, oh, maybe it. If not, you've heard who told me it was okay if anything happens.
But I think it's the modern science.
Yeah. Yes.
I've no idea. You might find that you've got second cousins somewhere who
absolutely.
are distant relatives of yours who could be living down the road in Manchester from you, and you don't know.
They could be living anywhere in the world, and it'd be wonderful to make contact. Very recently, not on my mum's side, but on my dad's side, I found via Facebook of all places, some fifth cousins who we've sort of managed to trace back. And
you've actually traced?
We actually traced back. So particularly on my mum's side, where at 13 you don't really know who your family, you know the very immediate family.
You barely know who you are. It's
yeah, but certainly aunts, uncles, cousins, they're just boring old people in many respects. And I think with all the trauma, like somebody asked me the other day, did my mum have siblings? And I thought, well, she's always said she didn't, but was there anything she was burying away? I don't know.
Yeah,
I'd imagine not, but
no, I think it's
very possible. There's things that could be discovered through DNA, so that would be very interesting.
So the other thing, and I picked up on it when you were talking earlier, was the fact that the UK opened this programme, which was in its terms relatively generous in letting 10,000 children in, but the idea that you would only let the children in and not their parents is, I don't know how the world would react now to a similar program. When we had the war in Ukraine, we opened up a scheme that allowed families in. The idea of just letting in the children both seems, as I say, incredibly lucky that she was one of the 10,000 let in, and incredibly cruel to say to her parents, you've got to wave her off at the train, you might never see her again, and to say to her, and she was at an age where she could understand.
Yes.
She wasn't a 3 or 4 year old who had no idea what was going on, but at age 13, almost 14, she understood that she was going on a long journey to the other side of the world.
Absolutely, yes. And I think that's a very, very difficult argument, as you say. I'd always thought, God, I'm so grateful that she was allowed out, did get here. Obviously, if she didn't, I wouldn't be here. But equally, why didn't they let her parents come in? But equally, if it's going to be 10,000 people, does that mean another 6,000, 7,000 children wouldn't have been allowed out and would have been murdered? The bigger question is, why weren't more people by more countries let in? And I think the arguments back then were very much the same arguments that we hear now, that they'll take our jobs, or they'll come here and they won't work, or they don't speak the same language.
With hindsight, it would have made no difference if more of Western Europe had let people in, because they were all then invaded anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as it happens, she was incredibly lucky that the scheme that existed was here and not somewhere just slightly east of here, because it wouldn't have helped.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
So in terms of your mother and her sort of attitude, what sort of person was she? Was she always traumatized? Did she get on with it? Was she very British? What was her thing?
I think she became very stoic. Whether she'd always been a stoic type person, or this the trauma that she'd been through taught her to be very stoic and get on with things. And on the surface, she was very positive, looking on the bright side, but there always felt there was an unspoken dark cloud there that you almost couldn't mention.
And I get the sense...
And she always wanted to help people.
But I get the sense she really didn't talk about it at all. And do you think that was you knowing you shouldn't ask, you just being, as you said, a kid who didn't ask and then it became too late and you never got round to it?
I think there was a mixture. She'd tell me snippets, and it wasn't only really until I put this talk together that I started piecing all the snippets together. So she told me a reasonable amount over the years. When I asked her, and we spoke about this earlier, Adam, that when she was probably in her 70s, I said, Mum, I know you don't like talking to me about it much, but will you, if I find someone who will, video your life story, just you talking over a period, that you might feel more comfortable. And she said, no, she just didn't want to talk about it in one go openly. But yet there was that almost the conflict with stuff on TV that must have looked identical in many respects to what she'd physically seen herself. She had to watch it, just couldn't avoid watching it. So it was always a big part of her and very, very important to her.
Martin, thank you for your time. Thank you for telling your family's story. Really, really appreciated. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me here, Adam.
Thank you.
Thank you.